The day Marlowe Hess got fired, he came home to find a 9-year-old girl sitting on his front steps with a cardboard box in her lap and nowhere else to go. Her name was Cleo. Her father, Marlowe's oldest friend, a man named Devlin Sauer, had died 4 days earlier from a heart attack at 41. Devlin had been raising Cleo alone since her mother left when Cleo was 3. There was no one else, no grandparents who were living, no aunts, no uncles who hadn't already said no. Marlowe found out later that a social worker had driven Cleo to his address because Devlin had listed him on a piece of notebook paper tucked into his will as the person to call if everything goes wrong. Marlowe stood on the walkway and looked at her. She looked back at him. She had Devlin's eyes, that particular shade of gray that looked different depending on the light. He had just been handed a box of his own belongings. 12 years at Calder Precision Manufacturing. 12 years of coming in early, staying late, turning down 2 other job offers because he actually believed, that the company valued what he built there. He'd developed 3 proprietary coating processes that reduced friction loss in high-speed industrial equipment. The patents were in his name. The applications were in their machines. He'd signed an agreement, one he'd been young enough and trusting enough not to have a lawyer look at, that assigned commercial rights to Calder upon termination. The VP of Operations had shaken his hand on the way out. Nothing personal, the man had said. His name was Aldrich Calder III, the founder's grandson, and he had worn a watch that cost more than Marlowe's annual salary. Marlowe set the box down on the steps next to Cleo. "You hungry?" he asked her. She nodded. He made her grilled cheese. It was the only thing he had. That was the beginning of a life neither of them had planned for. Marlowe was 37. He had a 2-bedroom house with a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom and a truck that needed new brake pads. He had savings, not much, but something. He had a name in the precision engineering world that was worth a fair amount, except that Calder Precision had quietly made calls to 3 firms he'd interviewed with the following month. He didn't know that yet. He just knew the phone stopped ringing. He took Cleo to enroll her in the local elementary school. The woman at the front desk asked who he was in relation to the child. Her guardian, he said. It took 4 months and a family law attorney he couldn't really afford to make that official. The social worker, a tired woman named Ms. Kwan who had too many cases and not enough hours, told him more than once that it would be easier to place Cleo with a family that was set up for this. Marlowe told her more than once that he was set up for this. He wasn't, but he figured that out as he went. The first year was the hardest. Cleo had night terrors. She would wake up screaming at 2 in the morning, and by the time Marlowe got to her room, she'd already be sitting up in bed, eyes open but not seeing anything. And he would sit on the floor beside her and talk until she came back to herself. He talked about engineering, about the properties of different metals, about why bridges are shaped the way they are. He didn't know what else to talk about. Eventually she started asking questions. She was a fast learner. She reminded him of her father. He got work where he could find it. Consulting under the table for a machine shop in Harrisburg. Technical writing on weekends. A 6-month contract with a company in Ohio that had him driving 2 hours each way, 3 days a week. He kept his costs low and his hours long, and he never let Cleo see how close the margins were. When she was 10, she found his folder of financial statements. She sat at the kitchen table with it open in front of her and didn't say anything when he walked in. He sat across from her. "We okay?" she asked. "We're okay," he said. She looked at him the way only a child who has already lost one parent looks at a person, calculating the probability of another loss. I promise we're okay," he said. "We've got what we need." She closed the folder. She never brought it up again, but he knew she hadn't forgotten. She started turning off lights in rooms she wasn't using. She stopped asking for things. He hated that. He hated that she'd learned to make herself smaller to protect him. So he started making sure she had things she didn't ask for. Library books she mentioned once and forgot about. A new pair of cleats when she made the soccer team. A plane ticket to visit her friend in Boston the summer she was 14. He found ways. You always find ways. There was a woman across town named Vera Stanton who was going through her own version of the same impossible year. She had grown up in Millhaven, left for law school, made partner at a firm in Philadelphia by 34. She had been good at her job the way some people are good at holding their breath. It didn't mean they were built for it. She'd worked, 70-hour weeks for a decade representing corporate clients she didn't believe in, and she'd been very well compensated for not believing in them. Then her mother had a stroke, and Vera came home to help, and the firm gave her 6 weeks and said they'd hold her position. They did not hold her position. She found out via email on a Tuesday. Her mother was asleep in the next room, home from the rehab facility, still relearning how to hold a spoon. Vera sat in her childhood kitchen and read the email 3 times. Then she called the managing partner, a man named Gerhard Lowe, and said things she would later describe as professionally inadvisable. He told her she was emotional. She told him she hoped his retirement was terrible. She hung up before he could respond. She stayed. Her mother needed her, and there was nothing in Philadelphia she had the energy to go back to. She found work at a small legal aid office in town, a fraction of her old salary, a tenth of her old status, and the most useful she'd felt in years. She took on cases for people who'd been cheated out of wages, people fighting wrongful evictions, people who'd signed contracts they hadn't understood. She was good at it, quietly, relentlessly good. She met Marlowe because his truck broke down in front of her office on a Thursday afternoon in November. He was waiting for the tow, and she came outside on her lunch break and stood on the sidewalk eating a sandwich, and they got to talking. She didn't know who he was. He didn't know who she was. He said he was an engineer. She said she was a lawyer. He said, "I have questions for a lawyer, actually." She said, "I have office hours tomorrow at noon." He came to her office with a folder. Inside the folder was the agreement he'd signed with Calder Precision 12 years earlier. She read it while he sat across from her. After a few minutes, she put it down and looked at him. "How old were you when you signed this?" 25. "Did you have legal representation?" "No." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you still have the original documentation on the patent applications? The R&D records, the development timeline, correspondence?" "I kept everything." "Of course you did," she said, not unkindly. She tapped the folder. "This agreement has problems, significant ones. I'd need more time to analyze the full picture, but there's language in here that may not be enforceable depending on how the patents were actually developed, whether company resources were used, what the timeline shows." Marlowe looked at her. "I've been letting this sit for 9 years. I know. I had other priorities." "I know," she said again, and something in the way she said it told him she meant it, that she understood what other priorities looked like when you were rebuilding a life from the ground up. He found out later about her mother, about the firm, about the legal aid work. He found out the way you find out things in a small town, gradually, through other people. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. Cleo was 22 by then, finishing her last year of a mechanical engineering degree at Penn State. She called every Sunday. She had Devlin's directness and Marlowe's precision, and she had developed, somewhere in between, a fearlessness that belonged entirely to herself. She had also, in the way of children who grow up watching a parent fight, developed a very specific kind of anger. The productive kind, the kind that builds things. She'd been watching the Calder situation her whole life. She'd seen the folder at 10. She'd asked questions at 15 that Marlowe had answered honestly because she was old enough and because she asked directly. She knew about the patents. She knew about the calls Calder had made to his prospective employers. They'd found that out eventually through a former colleague who'd had a change of conscience after his own retirement. She knew everything. What Marlowe didn't know, not yet, was that Cleo had not simply been finishing an engineering degree. She had a minor in business. She had spent 3 summers interning at a private equity firm in Pittsburgh, whose founder was a woman named Tate Drummond, 62 years old, who had a reputation for acquiring undervalued industrial companies and restructuring them into something profitable. Tate had noticed Cleo in her first week. She had, as she told Cleo later, a very specific type of radar for people who are working harder than the circumstance explains. She'd taken her to lunch. She'd listened to what Cleo told her. She had said, at the end of that lunch, "I'd like to understand more about this when you're ready." They had been having quiet conversations for 2 years. Vera found out about all of this before Marlowe did. Cleo called her on a Sunday in March. She had Vera's number because Marlowe had added her to his emergency contact list the previous year, in the unceremonious way he did most things, and said, "I want to tell you something and then I'd like your legal read on it." Vera sat down. Cleo laid it out. Tate Drummond's firm had been watching Calder Precision for 18 months. The company had been managed badly for years. Aldrich Calder III had cashed out a significant portion of his equity. The board was fragmented. 2 of their largest contracts had lapsed. The company was, in financial terms, soft. Tate's firm had identified it as an acquisition target. Cleo had been the one to bring it to their attention. "Does your dad know?" Vera asked. "Not yet." "Why not?" There was a pause. "Because I wanted to know if we had a case first. If we go in with the acquisition and we don't have a legal foundation, we're just his kid buying something expensive to make him feel better. If we go in with the acquisition and we have a case about the patents, about what they did to his employment prospects, then we're correcting something that was wrong. Those are different things." Vera understood the distinction immediately. It was exactly the kind of distinction she would have made. "Walk me through the timeline," she said. "The full thing. Development dates, filing dates, the agreement he signed. Everything Tate's firm has on their current ownership of the applications." Cleo walked her through it. It took 90 minutes. When it was over, Vera sat at her kitchen table for a long time without saying anything. Outside, the March light was going thin and gray over the backyard, the kind of light that made everything look like it was deciding whether to stay or go. "Cleo," she finally said, "I think there's a real case here. I think there may have been recoverable damages all along. But I want you to know something before we go any further." "What?" "The law is one thing. What it can prove is one thing. But what your father actually needs, I'm not sure that's the same as winning a legal argument. And I think you know that." Another pause. "That's why I want to do both," Cleo said. They told Marlowe on a Friday evening in April. He was making dinner. Cleo had driven up from State College, and Vera had walked over from her house 3 blocks away. They sat at the kitchen table and Cleo laid out the folder. A different folder from the one he'd given Vera, this one thicker, organized with the particular neatness of someone who'd been building it over a long time. He read it without speaking. The financial analysis of Calder's current position, the acquisition structure Tate Drummond's firm was prepared to move on. The legal memo Vera had drafted, carefully, cautiously, with all the appropriate qualifiers, on the enforceability of the original agreement and the potential grounds for a damages claim. He got to the last page. He put it down. He looked at Cleo. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. 2.5 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not one emotion but several, in sequence too fast to name individually. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I never asked you to, Dad." She said it simply, not cutting him off exactly, just placing it in the space between them. "I know you didn't ask. That's not the point." He looked down at the folder again. Vera watched him from across the table. She had seen people receive difficult news in her legal career, and she had seen people receive good news. And she had learned that sometimes those reactions look identical. The same stillness, the same controlled breathing, the same careful way of holding the body. "What does this actually require of me?" he asked. "Your records," Vera said. "The full R&D documentation. And we'd need you to participate in the damages claim if we pursue it. Depositions, likely. It's not a small undertaking, but it's a real case." "It's a real case," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. There was a moment, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. "And the acquisition?" he asked. "Tate is ready to move," Cleo said. "The structure would bring me in as part of the leadership team. The plan is to actually fix the company, the safety issues, the contract problems, the management structure. It's not a cleanup job. It's a real operation. And what happens to the name?" Cleo met his eyes. "We've been going back and forth on that. Tate says from a market recognition standpoint, Calder has value. But that's her analysis, not my preference." She paused. "I want to call it Sauer Hess Precision." Marlowe went very still. Devlin Sauer, Marlowe Hess. The 2 men who had started this whole thing, one gone too young, one still sitting in his kitchen at 51, trying to process what his daughter had handed him. He didn't say anything for a long time. The dinner on the stove went cold. No one moved to address it. "Devlin would have thought that was ridiculous," he finally said. "Probably," Cleo said. "He also would have thought it was right." Marlowe put his hand over her daughter's hand on the table and kept it there. The legal claim settled 14 months later. Calder Precision's legal team had initially pushed back hard, but Vera had spent those months building a record that was difficult to argue against. The original development logs, The internal communications she'd obtained through discovery that showed Aldrich Calder III had been briefed on the scope of Marlowe's contributions before the termination, the evidence that calls had been made to prospective employers. The settlement amount was not public. What was public was the statement that Calder Precision Manufacturing had reached an agreement with former employee Marlowe Hess regarding intellectual property matters. It was a small paragraph in an industry newsletter. Marlowe read it at his kitchen table and thought about the version of himself who had stood in that parking lot 12 years earlier, holding a cardboard box, driving home to a girl who was sitting on his steps with nowhere to go. He thought about what he would tell that person if he could. He decided the main thing he would say was, keep the records, keep everything, and go home. Go home and make her something to eat. The acquisition closed in the fall. Cleo moved to Harrisburg to run operations. Vera handled the legal work for the transition. Tate Drummond flew in for the signing and shook Marlowe's hand and said she had been in business for 35 years. And she had never seen a deal with this particular backstory. Most acquisitions are just money, she said. This one was something else. Marlowe didn't know what to say to that, so he said thank you and meant it. On the first day of operations under the new structure, Cleo sent him a photo. It was the sign above the main entrance. New font, clean fabrication, the letters precise and even. Sauerhest precision. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about Devlin. He thought about the 9-year-old girl with the cardboard box. He thought about all the Sunday phone calls. All the engineering problems, discussed at 2 in the morning, when he couldn't think of anything else to say. All the lights she turned off in rooms she wasn't using because she was trying to protect him. He sent back a single message. Your father would have liked this. She called him instead of texting back. He picked up on the first ring. Neither of them said anything at first. They just stayed on the line, breathing, the way people do when there is too much to put into words, and both of them know it, and neither of them minds. Outside the window of his house, the October light was doing what October light does in Pennsylvania, going gold and then amber and then something deeper. Something that doesn't have a name but that you recognize when you see it. The kind of light that falls on things and makes them look exactly like what they are.